Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the podcast titled When Wildfire Comes. My name is Dr. Christopher Potter, and I'm a wildfire scientist with over 30 years of experience working for NASA, the country's space agency, and also with local communities that have been impacted by wildland fires. I've studied wildfire on the urban interface using satellite imagery and ground measurements for really all the most destructive fires in the western U.S. over the last 20 years or so, and have published dozens of science papers on the science of fire science of these events. And I myself live in a high-risk wildfire zone in Northern California, so have experienced fire coming to our community firsthand. But today, we have the privilege to hear from our special invited guest about their close encounter with a major wildfire, a wildland fire that occurred over the past couple of years in 2021. I should say this is not a breaking news report, of course. It's a couple of years later, but really it's a more of an in-depth case study episode in this podcast series during which our guests can recount their reactions, their feelings, their firsthand observations, their decisions they made as the wildfire approached and threatened to burn down towns and communities in which they may live or work very closely with. And we, of course, also want to look at the lessons to be learned from such a catastrophic event and those that were prevented from being catastrophic. So today I'm very pleased and honored to welcome our special guest. He is Assistant Chief Brian Newman with the Amador Eldorado unit of CALFIRE. Chief Newman has a wealth of experience to bring to this, including talking about the fire that is the focus of today's particular podcast episode, and that's the Caldor Fire. The Caldor Fire that burned over 228 acres, 220,000 acres, I should say, in the Eldorado National Forest and surrounding counties. The Caldor Fire was first reported on Saturday, August 14th in 2021, and it took another 2 months or so to contain it fully. It destroyed over 1,000 structures and damaged almost 100 more, primarily around the U.S. Highway 50 corridor and in the community of Grizzly Flats, which is a rural community near where the fire started. On August 30th, it became the second fire ever known to cross the Sierra Nevada mountain range, that is, crest the Sierra. That was following the Dixie Fire, which had crossed just a few days earlier. So this was really an unprecedented event to burn this high and this severely over the crest of the Sierra mountain range. And it threatened communities in Myers and South Lake Tahoe being a very popular tourist destination. Caused evacuations to be ordered for more than 20,000 people before that fire's progress was not just halted, but avoided from burning into those city areas. So that's the basic background on the Caldor Fire. Now I'm going to let our special guest introduce himself. Captain, can you please tell our listeners about who you are and your role at CALFIRE and your history there?
All right, thanks for having me on today. I really appreciate it. Like was stated, my name's Brian Newman. I'm currently an assistant chief with CALFIRE in the Amador Eldorado unit. My day-to-day responsibilities is overseeing all the CALFIRE operations in the Lake Tahoe Basin and Alpine County of our unit. I have over 30 years of experience with CALFIRE, starting from a firefighter on an engine and working my way up through the ranks. I've worked in various locations throughout our area. I've worked in our emergency command center, our 911 dispatch center. I've overseen that for a few years. I'm responsible for overseeing our vegetation management program, so fuels reduction, and making sure that we're providing forest health and fuel reduction for our communities and such. And then, like I said, overseeing all the operations, including collaboration between all the agencies, fuel reduction efforts, agreements and coordination between local, state, and federal agencies in the Lake Tahoe Basin. I also serve as a fire behavior analyst for one of our incident management teams. So that gives me the opportunity to understand fire and weather to a greater extent and really have that add to my abilities and experiences.
That's great, Chief. That's we really want to hear about many of those dimensions in relation to the Caldor Fire, and you told me just before the podcast that you were also working on the Dixie Fire, which was another enormous fire, just that was burning at the same time as Caldor, basically, and did also destroy numerous structures. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, the Dixie Fire was a very, very interesting fire from my perspective of size, but also just its sheer veracity of how it moved through the landscape, destruction of communities and forests, and the distance that it traveled is just something we hadn't seen before. So it was very, very challenging. I was working as a fire behavior analyst on that fire prior to coming back to the areas of South Lake Tahoe for the Caldor Fire. So seeing that kind of back to back and seeing how fire was acting in 2021 was just really quite amazing.
Yeah, yeah. We keep having to use the word unprecedented, but in this case, again, it's appropriate. So I was wondering next, then, hoping next that maybe you could take 10, 15 minutes, whatever you'd like, really, to recount, the your experience on the day when you first came over to work on the Caldor Fire, what was happening. Um, Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you understand it started and where it started around the small community of Grizzly Flats, and that's just south of Placerville. Is that right? In Eldorado County.
That's correct.
So yeah, so please take it away and and what you recall about those first few days when it started, and also and particularly like what was the weather like as it started up?
Okay, yeah, and as you mentioned, mid-August was when the fire started in the evening, and at that time in 2021, we were in a very dry drought type condition that had been persisting for many years. We had a short period of reprieve in 2016 and 2017, but generally we were under roughly 10 years of drought. And so when the Caldor Fire took off, it wasn't the only fire going on. As mentioned, we had the Dixie Fire going on. We still had remnants of the Tamarack Fire, which was over in Alpine County. That was happening, and there's numerous other fires throughout California and the West. So that really puts a strain on our resources and our ability to manage and handle new emerging fires like the Caldor Fire. So despite the fact that it started in the evening in kind of a higher elevation, roughly 4,000-ish feet location and heavy timber, we did have a good, robust response from resources, but it did take a little while to get to it. It was relatively remote. It was in an area where people were on their side-by-sides and UTVs to access it. So obviously a struggle to access for fire engines and equipment and such. And so we were able to get the crews were able to get down there within a reasonable time, but the fire had established itself pretty quickly in that drainage, in the river drainage there, and started to grow pretty aggressively. Overnight, it didn't become humongous right out the gates, but it was really a strain to try to control. And the primary efforts initially were to protect the community of Oma Ranch, which is directly adjacent and to the west of where the fire started. And so that's the primary efforts were trying to do perimeter control and keep the fire from in that area. And ultimately, the crews and the equipment and everything was successful from preventing Oma Ranch from suffering any losses of homes or anything like that. So, generally successful over that first night. But as that fire continued to grow up to the north and east, through the terrain, through the drought-stricken fuels, and through the heavy vegetation dead and down. It just grew exponentially. The weather wasn't necessarily abnormal. It was middle summer, so August being what it is, and warm and dry, and we there was no real strong winds. It was just predominant slope-driven winds that we normally get. Our diurnal wind directions where we get up slope up canyon in the mid mornings and throughout the day. So that wasn't necessarily the driving factor of the fire so much. It was just the heavy fuels and the steep topography. So as the fire progressed towards Grizzly Flat, that is a community that is very rural, really has one way in, one way out on a main road. There are a couple small roads that go out through the forest that eventually wind their way back towards civilization and bigger roadways, but much more difficult to traverse than the normal one way in, one way out. And so that's a community that is the definition of wildland urban interface. Homes surrounded by tall trees and choked canyons of brush and just all available fuel types to be able to burn. And so that area had been a focus, like many of our areas in the foothills, had been a focus of fuel reduction efforts, trying to recognize where the threats may come from up one of the major drainages and some of the areas there. But much like all the communities that we deal with, it's a continual challenge to be able to try to protect a community from a quote unquote normal fire, which may be a small fire that starts in the community and is able to be extinguished or handled in a short order time, versus a large catastrophic fire that starts nearby but has a good head of steam and has a lot of energy and is able to unfortunately roar into a community such as that one and cause a huge amount of devastation. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's what happened with Grizzly Flat.
Yeah, and these homes were, um, for lack of a better word, embedded in the forest area, right? There wasn't a lot of open space around them.
Right. Yeah. We as an agency between ourselves and the U.S. Forest Service, we conduct defensible space inspections, and we encourage the residents to perform that same work for their homes. The 100 foot of defensible space and being able to protect their homes and their community. But absolutely, this was an area that was surrounded, and the homes were completely interlaced through the trees and through the vegetation there. And so, unfortunately, it was just the perfect storm of topography, fuels, and homes interspersed through there that resulted in that near complete devastation of the community.
Yeah. And how you said that, I'll of course let you keep going here because we got a lot more to go, a lot more terrain to burn here. Um, as we move up into the Sierra with the days that followed. But when do you think it became a crown fire? Was it during the night or the next morning when the winds came up?
And crown fire gets thrown around kind of in a general sense. Oftentimes, a fire does move into the crowns when the conditions are right in terms of fuel, weather, and topography. So, looking at the burn severity after the fact, it was clear that there was crown fire burning into the community, but it wasn't a sustained crown fire over its entirety of the fire or the duration. Generally, crown fire, as the fire moves upslope with some wind behind it and some energy and with heavy fuels, it will climb into the crowns with lighter fuels assisting it and get it into the crowns of the trees and start burning with much more intensity and much more speed. But as it transitions into downsloping, and so if the fire crests a slope and then the terrain becomes more favorable, in other words, the fire is burning downhill rather than uphill, oftentimes it will stop being a crown fire and revert back to being on the ground and still with intensity, but with lesser rates of spread. The unfortunate part for Grizzly Flat is that it sits on a ridge between two major river drainages. So the ability for the fire to get into the crowns and burn with severe intensity and rates of spread was very high, and that's a contributing factor to the amount of damage and the severity of the fire as it entered into the community overall.
Yeah, yeah. So then, in the days following, as it progressed up in elevation towards Lake Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe, it was burning through a lot of U.S. Forest Service timberlands. Is that right? And then towards the ski resorts there.
Yes, absolutely. As it moved out of Grizzly Flat and continued up to the east and northeast, the fortunate part of it is that there isn't really any large communities directly in its path. And so it predominantly progressed on a line from Grizzly Flat towards the ski resort at Sierra Tahoe and the communities of Strawberry and Phillips and those areas kind of directly west of the Sierra Crest there at Echo Summit on Highway 50. It did have the one side of the fire, which would be kind of the left side of the fire if you're looking from, space looking down at it. It did move towards the community of Pollock Pines, and that is a huge concern for us as well. There's thousands of homes, much more than there were in Grizzly Flat, in forested communities. But fortunately, because of a number of reasons, there was limited losses there in Pollock Pines. A couple of contributing factors that I think is important to recognize for that is one, it was the kind of the flank or the left side of the fire, so it did have some intensity and it was moving with speed towards Pollock Pines in that area, but it wasn't the direct head of the fire, so it was a little less intense. But more importantly, it burned in towards an area under vegetation management program that we have. We have over 4,500 acres under this program within the department that we have been doing fuel reduction efforts on since 1981. And as part of that is conducting prescribed fire and fuel reduction and forest health, all for the intent of protecting the communities from fires that come from the forest. And it did exactly that. We were able to utilize the reduced fuel and the shaded fuel breaks and the amount of work that we have done over the course of so many years to be able to have the fire reduce in intensity and rate of spread and really allow for a foothold to be able to put in control lines and have the fire crews be able to work more directly and protect the community. So that was a vital area that obviously has proved its worth in regards to protecting that community there of Pollock Pines and preventing the fire from really progressing further to the direct north towards Highway 50.
Yeah, that's such an important point for our listeners to appreciate is that not only are you taking out fuels that could spread the fire more quickly, hotter, producing more burning embers that can fly into the next canyon or whatever, but you're creating the space for the firefighters to work in. Is that right? Like they can see what's on the ground in front of them and move around if the trees have been thinned even, right?
Right. It allows for that intensity of the fire to reduce. It allows for the crews to be able to see what the fire is doing, see the topography, see the fire activity, and just have a more comfortable and safer spot for the crews to be able to work directly on the fire's edge with that reduced intensity compared to areas that haven't been treated where you can easily imagine grass and then brush and then smaller trees and then larger trees all together that allow for just an intense amount of fire that would be very difficult to work directly adjacent to be able to prevent the fire spread. So that's a key element of that area and that defensible space and that vegetation management project that we have.
Yeah, that's a really heartening to know there's a success story embedded in all this, and some of the forests there were even under private forest timber management as well, and and we're being taken care of that way.
Yes, absolutely. As part of that vegetation management project, it's not land that is owned by CALFIRE. It's private land. Part of it's owned by the Eldorado Irrigation District, and part of it's owned by Sierra Pacific Industries. And we do that work in collaboration with those two agencies for that exact reason of fire safety, but also for forest health. And Sierra Pacific Industries has an immense amount of land that was in within the Caldor Fire. So if it wasn't national forest land, the vast majority of the land that was damaged within that area west of the crest was Sierra Pacific lumber. What was their production stock, was their forested lands, and they do a great job of maintaining their forest for forest health and obviously for production. They're a business, but also for recognizing fire danger. And so some of the differences you see in the severity of fire as the Caldor Fire moved to the north and east is the difference between areas that were managed under private land for forest health and for production versus national forest lands that weren't necessarily managed in that respect. So there's a definite difference in regards to intensity and how the fire spread through those different areas.
Yeah, that's fascinating to see. And I know you can see it in the NASA satellite imagery we have, and analyzed after the fire for intensity, the shapes of the burns, the fuel left behind, all that. So yeah, that's great to hear that we can do something about it, and it helps for us overall to be healthier and to be more fire resilient, resistant, etc. So in the days following that, was and we can talk about why South Lake Tahoe had to be evacuated. Was it a did it come as a surprise that it kept moving the way it did?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that is it moved up towards the community of Strawberry, and in and around that area of Strawberry, there's a very predominant feature of granite and rock. There's the Lover's Leap area, which is a very popular rock climbing area, and a very predominant rock feature. And that rock feature is pretty. Uh, it runs to the south towards the area of Kirkwood Ski Resort and Caples Lake in that area. And so the kind of the theory or the thought was that as the fire progressed into that area, that just the lack of fuels and the fact that there was a large granite feature, which, traditionally in the past that has been a stopping point for fires, is if there's a large mountain or a large bit of granite or something we can use as a control feature, then we put that into the strategy and obviously build fire line and build a strategy of reducing fuels ahead of the main fire with backfires and those types of things to be able to reduce that fire intensity as it got closer to that. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case here. There was a couple places where there were stringers of fuel or lines of vegetation, trees, and such that did span through that rock. And like I said, typically we could put that as a stopping point, but the fire burn with just immense intensity that it continued right through those areas in the evening. As a matter of fact, it wasn't middle of the day under strong winds, under extreme conditions. It was quote unquote normal conditions for the time of year, and it was well into the evening, 7, 8 o'clock at night, as the fire progressed into Strawberry and through that area and continued to just march its way to the east towards Sierra Tahoe Ski Resort and the area of Phillips, and then eventually to the top of Echo Summit and down into Lake Tahoe. So that was definitely an area where I don't know if the word surprised was necessarily appropriate, so much as disappointing being able to not use that as our control feature and really recognize that this was not a fire that was going to stop at those places, that we were going to have to really use some tactics that were going to be really challenging for us because equipment trying to work in those rocks and equipment trying to work in those very rugged terrain and getting people through there where the fuels are are dense and the fire intensity is very high and it's outpacing our ability to put in control line was very, very challenging as that fire progressed towards the top of the pass there before it dropped into Lake Tahoe.
Yeah. Could you tell us a little bit about the air attack at this point?
Yeah, so obviously we utilize all available assets that we could get our hands on. So, we have air attack that is overhead of the fires, our coordination, and we're using all of the available air tankers that we have. So everything from our normal S2 tankers, which are carrying 1,200 gallons of retardant and are very agile and very effective for fires that, especially in brush and grass and brush. But we're also using the very large air tankers, the DC-10s and the large airline style tankers that were dropping thousands of gallons of retardant at a time, and then coupled that with the helicopters that were dropping retardant and water, and so a very coordinated effort of all that. But they're also limited by some of the actions that the fire is presenting. So if the smoke is too thick and they can't get right into the head of the fire to extinguish that makes it very difficult. The terrain also makes it very difficult for them, and then it becomes challenging as we get into the nighttime hours. Our fixed wing air tankers, they don't fly at night because of obvious safety issues. Trying to navigate through low level terrain, smoke, fire while dropping retardant is just not something that our fixed wing air tankers do, but we have nighttime dropping helicopters that help and assist with that as well. So we
Mhm.
were literally throwing everything at it that we had in terms of ground resources, air resources, and coordinating that effort all through the area. And ultimately, some of those become point protection. So the community of Strawberry along Highway 50, the fire impacted that community as well. But unlike Grizzly Flat, we were able to protect that community because of all those concerted efforts between all those ground and aerial resources and being able to steer the fire around it. So it became point protection of trying to protect communities and homes and infrastructure while trying to obviously reduce the spread of the fire. But we have a set of priorities of life, property, environment, and so we were concentrating on those efforts, trying to make sure that we were protecting
Yeah.
communities and infrastructure.
Yeah. So when it came to evacuating Lake Tahoe, how did that happen? What resources did you have at your disposal? Whether it was texting everyone, sirens, local responders. How did that happen? And did it happen in an orderly way that you were pleased with?
Yeah, it's kind of it was good and we had some lessons learned from it, both good and challenging. So myself and the Forest Service Assistant Chief Kyle Jacobson, um, we were both there in South Lake Tahoe, and we were both part of the incident organization as an additional incident management team was brought into South Lake Tahoe to help organize the resources and efforts up there. And so we were both in the role of operations section chiefs, and really what that means is that we're directing the resources from a kind of a global standpoint of the setting the priorities of the day and setting the direction of where we want the resources to engage the fire and everything to do with evacuation planning and all the kind of the nuts and the bolts of putting it all together. So when the fire progressed over the crest in the area of Christmas Valley, which is in the community of Myers. It came off of that hillside there and along Highway 50 in Echo Summit and spotted across Christmas Valley to the east side of that. And but as we saw that it was doing that, we were working. Our part of the incident management organization was working with other part the fire west of Strawberry, and there was evacuation planning in place to do an orderly evacuation of the Lake Tahoe Basin from west to east. And so one of the things that was beneficial for us was that there was not as many people in South Lake Tahoe and in the Tahoe area that we would normally expect to have on any given summer day. And that's because there was so much smoke being produced by the fire before it even got to Lake Tahoe that really just wasn't really a sustainable area to people to recreate and to be in. And so predominantly there were some tourists obviously, and then otherwise it was the people that live in the community, the residents themselves. So it was reduced numbers that we had to work with, which was good. And so we made the decision when the fire got to a point where it was obvious that it was not going to be stopped in Strawberry or in Phillips or area at South Lake Tahoe, that we had a decision point that if it got to a certain area that we were going to evacuate the basin, the South Lake Tahoe portion of the basin. And so when the fire hit that decision point, we enacted that decision to evacuate the California side of it. So we evacuated from Myers and into the city and over towards the Nevada side and at state line, recommending that everyone evacuate off to the east over Kingsbury Grade and out Highway 50 towards Carson City. And it didn't go perfect. We're not going to claim that it did. It did start off relatively orderly, but then as evacuation, as any best laid plans, the word got out that we were evacuating, which was fine. People recognizing, it wasn't under duress of immediate fire impingement on the community, and that was really the goal, was to evacuate well ahead of the fire getting to the community. And so it wasn't that there was fire all around the cars or people as they're trying to evacuate. It was orderly in the respects of that time frame. But just as the overall order to evacuate went out to the community, people started just packing their things and leaving. And so the idea was to evacuate from the west to the east and hopefully have an orderly fashion and not necessarily have the roads choked up with cars and such. But people being what they are, and completely understandable, they packed their cars and evacuated, even as it got into the city and further points further east. So there was times when the traffic was at a near standstill and was a challenge to move. But like I said, we evacuated out many hours and days ahead of the fire actually getting to there. So it wasn't that we were trying to be orderly in that respect and not wait too long to try to evacuate, knowing that there were still 40,000 people we had to evacuate out of the community.
Yeah, yeah. There was no reason for panic at that point because you're well ahead of the game, and people being what they are, they're like herding cats out of there probably, huh? So I understand, we can all understand the challenge of doing that, especially when people don't want to leave their homes behind either, right?
Absolutely. That's the thing that's really, it's something that we, as all the agencies, recommend, of having a list, and we call it Ready, Set, Go on the CALFIRE website, where we recommend people preparing themselves for fire season and times of evacuation, and recognizing what they would want to take with them, the critical elements, medications, and important documents, and photographs, and things to be able to sustain themselves. And it's one of those things, I've seen it many times. I've evacuated people with fire around their homes and fire around their cars and under near the people under near panic, versus communities being evacuated days and days in advance. But generally, and this is just a human nature element of it, but generally people aren't thinking about those parts and pieces of that, what they would need to take, until they're faced with it, until it's right in front of them. And then it becomes a real challenge to recognize of what they need to take, what they want to take, and can they fit it in the vehicle they're driving in, and being able to leave in a reasonable time.
Yeah. And those living on the outskirts of the city, in a more suburban area, do they often give you the feedback like we'd like to stay and help fight this
Sometimes that
fire with our
does.
sprinklers and our that sort of thing?
Yes and no. Generally, we recommend when we have an event such as this where we had the time to be able to evacuate people, we want people to evacuate. There are times when a fire, if, a brand new emerging fire that starts that's going to immediately impact a community, where we would recommend shelter in place. And that is the point of staying in their home or their building that they're living in, let the fire pass by, and then we'll evacuate after that. But this was not that kind of situation. This was days in advance that we're evacuating. And so there was really good intentions. Some of the things that I hadn't seen before that I saw on the Caldor Fire up there when we evacuated people is people took their propane tanks for their barbecues and their gas fire pits and such, and they put them on the sides of the road. Away from their homes.
Oh,
And so when we were driving through the community, we were trying to figure out why is there so many propane tanks around here? And people wanted them away from their homes so that they wouldn't ignite and cause their home to burn if a fire came through there. And hadn't experienced that before. So that was kind of a new one for us to be able to look at and say, well, we probably should not have these around the side of the road. So let's move them off the side of the road. Um, and then good intentions as well as people turning on their sprinklers. They were either turning on their residential sprinklers or they're putting hoses out and letting them run over the roofs and such, which individually sounds like a reasonable response, but in reality, it created a huge impact on the water system. So we spent a lot of time with resources driving around turning off sprinklers because it made a significant draw on the water system and it limited our ability to draw water out of the hydrant system because the hydrants
yeah,
run off of the domestic water supply the same as sprinklers for the homes do.
that's such an important lesson for homeowners in rural communities, like relatively rural communities like that, or suburban communities, to know is that the firefighters need that water and they need to direct it where they need it most, right? Not necessarily to your roof, but to have adequate pressure to really hit it where it's most needed. So it's really among the many lessons you've already told us today, to document and to pass on. And it's different maybe in a more a situation like Los Angeles, of course, in Los Angeles County, completely different.
Right. Right.
Right. And so this has been really great. Let's wind up maybe by saying that the fire did pass south of South Lake Tahoe, right, and was kept several like a mile or two away from the structures on the southern end of the community there, successfully with local firefighting and CAL FIRE efforts to keep it up in the upper areas of the mountains around South Lake Tahoe.
Yeah, generally, one of the successes that we look at is we did not lose a single structure in the Lake Tahoe Basin from the Caldor Fire. We did have a couple structures that were damaged, but because of the sheer amount of resources that we had, we were able to keep that fire as those spot fires went onto those decks or those homes. We're able to keep that damage really minimal. So that is a success for us. The fire did burn right into the backyards and front yards of homes in the Myers and South Lake Tahoe area. But again, much like we mentioned about our vegetation management project on the West Slope, the Forest Service and local agencies have done fuel reduction efforts all along the homes behind the Apache area. And it wasn't just, that was a big part of it. But another part of it that can't be overlooked is the amount of effort that the community themselves put into it. They've taken fuel reduction and they've taken defensible space and they've taken home hardening serious. And those things together really resulted in the success and the silver lining of the fire in the Lake Tahoe area of the no homes lost, because it was a group effort between not just the agencies and the fire crews and the advanced planning, but the community as a whole taking that serious and doing their part to allow for the fire crews to defend the homes and not have to do last second fuel reduction efforts around homes in defensible space, or allowed for the crews to engage on the fire's edge. And I think it's a really important lesson to take away about home hardening and defensible space, and how important and how an effective role it played in this fire for the community.
Yeah, that is great to hear. That it is a community effort. Everyone has their part, but also um, making sure that you make your entire neighborhood um, defensible on its perimeters, and then just get out of the way and let the pros do their job. So um, I guess we're about at the end of the time period I usually use, Chief Newman. But so I want to thank you very much for sharing all these amazing insights and the knowledge you had of all these Sierra Nevada fires. They're very different from fires along the California coast or in LA County. And this recording was made to document some of those very important lessons learned, techniques used in that sort of terrain in mountainous California area, and the region around Lake Tahoe, which is always going to be at risk. So we wanted to capture that knowledge and your collective memory of those like you who were there to experience it. So again, thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule. And I wish you and all the firefighters there safety and success in all the future incidents to which you're called.
Absolutely. I really appreciate you having me on and allowing us to, highlight lessons learned and kind of revisit some of those things that we may have, short-term lost of that. So being able to remind not just us as the agencies and the communities, but all those listeners who can maybe take advantage of some of the knowledge and experiences and move that forward. So I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, we try to get I try to get people in the fire safe communities, all over the state to listen to these podcasts. And if fire hasn't come to their community yet, and they live in the Sierra Nevada region, this particular episode is really going to be valuable to them, I think, as they prepare, and because our climate is changing. And while maybe the conditions of wind weren't so unusual before and during the Caldor Fire, the humidity and dryness was extremely low, right? So climate is changing and affecting things, and as well as fuel patterns. So thanks again, really appreciate it. And So I'll say to our listeners, that wraps up another episode of When Wildfire Comes. Tell your friends about us. Check back regularly for new editions, and say goodbye to Chief Newman. And hope everyone can be fire safe. Thanks, Chief.
Thank you.
Okay.